Good morning. Never fails it. You always have to do something extra once you get up in front. It's good to see everybody here this morning. It's been a long time since I've had the opportunity to speak to the whole group. So one member said, hope you will provoke us to love and good deeds, and I promised simply that I would provoke. So we'll go from there. We'll see where it goes. So I hope that you enjoy this lesson. This lesson came from a lot of study really over the years that had brought me to the realization that there are some things that some of the people that we read about all the time have in common that maybe we haven't thought about, and there must be a lesson there somewhere. So that's what we're going to take a look at today. See if we can get our slide to come up. Striving for second. That seems a little weird, doesn't it? Somebody asked me, is that striving for second base? I said, no, that's not it. But we are striving for second all the time, and I hope to make this clear by the time that we're done. We're going to take a look at, first of all, Joseph. Come on, you can do it there. Anybody recognize that? How many of you have seen the play Joseph in the Technicolor Dreamcoat? Quite a few. I've never seen it, and I thought when it came out, I had no idea what it meant because I hadn't been introduced to the scriptures yet at that time. And I think that probably his coat did not look like that one. You know, that would have been something if they could have created that. But one thing I do know, his coat of many colors that Jacob had given him was not like everybody else's. It was special. Now, was it as special as that one? I'm sure it wasn't. But none of the other sons, and Jacob had 12, had a coat like that one. Jacob was a favorite son. He was a favored son to the point that he was probably spoiled. Some would say arrogant. But more than anything, he was a dreamer. You know, Benjamin was also a favorite son of Jacob's, but he didn't get a coat like that. There was something about Joseph. So his brothers called him a dreamer. He told them dreams. And the dreams seemed to say that someday, brothers, you're going to bow down to me in subjection. And even to the point of saying, mother and father and brothers, someday you will bow down to me in subjection. So there are a lot of commentators that say that maybe he was arrogant and spoiled. I kind of wonder about that because it turns out so much differently in the end when he gets older. But perhaps that was just youth. And he came across as arrogant because he just didn't know any better. Maybe he's excited about these dreams, just wanted to tell somebody. And didn't understand what they meant yet. There was going to come a time when he would understand, certainly. But we also know that partly because of this wonderful coat, and now I want to see the play, this wonderful coat that he had that was so different, and he wore it apparently everywhere because he went to see his brothers to take them some supplies when they were out with the flocks, a long ways from home, and he still had this coat of many colors. So was it just showing off? Maybe. But the brothers didn't like him to the point of wanting to kill him. Most of them did anyway. Reuben kind of got a guilty conscience, and he wasn't willing to go along with killing him, so they just sold him. They sold him to some slave traders, spice merchants, and eventually he ended up in Egypt. And probably looked a lot more drab, much like that. So he was sold into Egypt, into slavery, eventually ended up in Potiphar's house. Potiphar works for the king. Potiphar works for Pharaoh. He's captain of the guard. He's a very important man. And Joseph works for him in his household, and Joseph worked so well and so hard and so carefully for his master that eventually he was put in charge of the household. He was in charge of everything. Genesis 39:6 says, so Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. Now Joseph was well built and handsome. We don't see those kinds of reflections very often in the scripture about someone's appearance, but once in a while. So Joseph was one of those people. So Joseph has been the favored son, the hated brother, a slave, but now a slave with some power, so to speak. Joseph again suffers another injustice when Pharaoh's wife, in anger, falsely accused him of trying to take advantage of her. So now he ends up in prison. Another injustice for Joseph. But he's in prison. And what's he going to do? This isn't fair. First, my brother sold me into slavery, and now I'm in prison, and all I did was the right thing. So now, instead of telling his own dreams, he's telling and interpreting other people's dreams. So the cupbearer and the baker, and I'm sure you're pretty familiar with all of the story. But being an excellent inmate, he again rises to a position of importance, perhaps even managing the prison as an inmate, as far as an inmate could. So he's an important man now in the prison, simply by doing the right thing, as far as we can tell. Well, eventually Pharaoh needs a dream interpreted. And a lot has passed, a lot of time has passed, years, a lot of pages in your Bible, if you want to read it all. So now we're to Genesis 41. And Pharaoh can't interpret the dream. It's got him bothered. He asks all of his interpreters, all of his sorcerers, what it means. And finally they come to Joseph, and Pharaoh asks Joseph for help. And in Genesis 41:16, Joseph says, I cannot do it. But God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. So keeping the glory where the glory is due. Without getting into too much detail again, Joseph is successful in interpreting the dream, and beyond that, he has a plan. We know that famine is coming to the land, but not until after several years, 7 years of plenty. And then the famine's going to come, and Joseph has all the information that Pharaoh needs. He has a plan for Pharaoh. He says, this is what we need to do. So Pharaoh says, okay, we'll do it. As a matter of fact, you take charge. 41:37 says, the plan seemed good to Pharaoh and all his officials. So Pharaoh asked them, can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt. So now he is second only to Pharaoh. Come on now. There we go. So let's talk about Daniel. That is the Lion of Babylon. That's an actual photo of an architectural or an artifact from Babylon. In Daniel, the first chapter, we're going to talk about Daniel a little bit now. Daniel chapter 1, verse 1 says, in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. Among these who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So here we have in Daniel another interpreter of dreams. Daniel has that ability too. The book of Daniel moves along very quickly. There's a lot of big things that happen real fast. And there's a lot of information, and we're not going to try to cover it all. We're just going to talk about this man, Daniel. Not so much what his messages and what his prophecies mean today, but this is an interesting guy. So as we get started, King Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. And he's troubled. And he wants his wise men to tell him what the dream means. But he says, wise men, if you're so wise, you tell me what the dream is and what it means. And I said, well, king, tell us the dream and we'll tell you what it means. He said, no. You say you're wise, you tell me the dream and tell me what it means. And of course they couldn't do that. They couldn't even get close. They had no idea what to do. So the king ordered that all the wise men be executed. These guys aren't worth having, so I'm just going to kill them all. Well, it turns out that Daniel and his friends are some of those wise men. In verse 14 in chapter 2 is an interesting passage. When Arioch, the commander of the king's guard, had gone out to put to death the wise men of Babylon, Daniel spoke to him with wisdom and tact. I think that's very interesting. Spoke to him with wisdom and tact. He reasoned with him, talked to him. And Daniel was given a chance to speak with the king and to interpret the dream. We're not going to go into what the dream was. That's a subject for another lesson, maybe several. But he interpreted the dream for the king. Let's just read a little bit of it in verse 45, chapter 2. This is the meaning of the vision of the rock cut out of a mountain, but not by human hands. A rock that broke the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold to pieces. The great God has shown the king what will take place in the future. And the dream is true, and its interpretation is trustworthy. Verse 48, then the king placed Daniel in a high position and lavished many gifts on him. He made him ruler over the entire province of Babylon and placed him in charge of all its wise men. Second only to Pharaoh. I shouldn't say Pharaoh, I should say Nebuchadnezzar. I messed up my own notes. A new king comes into power in Babylon a few years later. His name is King Darius. And in chapter 6, it pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel. Notice how Daniel has risen and stayed at the top. The satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss. Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. So again, he's back to being second only to the king. But due to the jealousy, trickery of these other officials, Daniel ends up tossed in the lion's den. Well, what happens? Well, King Darius liked Daniel a lot. He had just goofed and signed into law something to put Daniel's life at risk. Actually, it was supposed to be taken. So he put him in the lion's den, but how does that story end? Verse 19, chapter 6, at the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve, continually been able to rescue you from the lions? Daniel answered, may the king live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight. Nor have I ever done wrong before you, your majesty. The king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him. Why? Because he had trusted in his God. And it goes on to where King Darius is praising God and putting God in charge of his kingdom. He says in verse 26, I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Daniel was in power and had enough influence that this king, from hundreds of miles away from Jerusalem, tells his entire kingdom, which was large, that God, the living God, was now their God. He was the God that they should honor, not all these other gods, the living God. Remember how Daniel got there? As a slave. Captured. Brought in to serve in the king's court because he was educated. But he had influence. He used his influence and his opportunity to prove that the living God was the God that mattered. So Daniel ended up serving at least 3 kings, Nebuchadnezzar, Darius, and Cyrus. And there's some others in there too that people talk about. Again, that's some fun things in that book. The handwriting on the wall, you ever wonder where that saying comes from? Read Daniel. So now we have one more that I want to tell the story about. In Esther. Esther chapter 2, verse 5 says, Now there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai. Now Susa is that little red bubble over on the right. And I wanted to kind of try and show how far it is from Jerusalem to Susa and Babylon. Babylon's just a little bit northwest of Susa. It's a long ways. They didn't just get taken from Dallas to Austin. They're hundreds of miles away from where they were. And it's a long trip. They don't go across the desert. They go up and around. They're a long way from home. And that's kind of what I wanted to get from the map. Give you a little bit of an idea what that's about. This is some of what's been recovered from that area, from Susa. There's some interesting archaeological finds from that area that you might want to look up. Just look at the images. It's amazing the size of some of the buildings that they built and some of the things that they were able to do, much like the Egyptians and so forth. So the Babylonians and all of the things that they had. Well, Mordecai had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, same as Daniel, only he ends up in a different city. And he's been taken there, and he had a cousin. In verse 7, Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he brought up because she had neither father nor mother. This young woman, who was also known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother died. So the total story of what we have here in Esther is really quite fascinating. The political intrigue, the treachery, all of the things that happen to Esther, how Esther becomes part of the king's harem, how she becomes a favorite, the influence that she began to have, but never giving up listening to Mordecai. Mordecai had brought her up in a proper manner. So if you read that first couple of chapters of Esther, you figure out what he's talking about. He raised her right. Well, she still listened to Mordecai even when she became queen. And it was because of her opportunity as queen to be able to talk to the king of the city, the province, that Mordecai was able to accomplish anything. So between the two of them, Esther and Mordecai, they were able to save the Jews. They would have all been killed because of a man named Haman. Now Haman, he's a bad guy. All he wants is power and glory. That's all he's interested in, is the power and the glory, and he doesn't care who it hurts. As a matter of fact, because he was mad at Mordecai, he decided to kill all the Jews. And he got the king to say, okay. It was going to happen. until Esther, at Mordecai's urging, talked to the king and managed to have that rescinded. And Mordecai, to make a long story short, ends up in charge. Mordecai takes the place of Haman as second in the kingdom, and that's the third of these three men that are now second. Daniel, Joseph, and Mordecai. They're second in their kingdom. They have come from nowhere to be second in the kingdom. They've come from being pulled out of their nation, taken essentially to the other side of the world, as far as they knew, to be raised in a different land, to be taken away from their people, and to live with people they can't even understand when they get there. I don't think any of them ever thought that they would be second only to the king in the areas that they went to. I can't imagine what they might have been thinking when they were taken from Jerusalem. They might not have thought they'd even live. They probably thought they'd never see Jerusalem again. If they'd listened to the prophets, they'd know that something was bad would happen, but there would be a remnant. There would be returning, but who knew when? I don't think they ever thought about being second. So how did they get there? It's interesting that even in the positions of power that they attained, that they remained faithful. They never wavered from following God, and this is one of the things that these three men have in common. They're put in some very strange and difficult situations, but they never got away from following their God. They always were faithful to God, even in the face of death. Every single time. So they had power and authority. Now, being faithful doesn't bring power and authority, but remaining faithful when you have power and authority is not easy. A lot of people fail at that. So what do they have in common besides what they accomplished? They were able to be at the top of the kingdom. They were able to remain faithful, but I think what they really had in common was a consistent lifestyle of faith, that they were able to remain faithful no matter what. They were in the worst of times, and they were in the best of times, personally. They were wealthy. Each one of them had everything that they could want materially. Being second in those three kingdoms was huge. You didn't have anything they wanted. Yet they remained faithful. Their consistency of faith is so impressive. Their lifestyle, I believe, is what made them special. I'm pushing the wrong button, aren't I? It works better when you push the right button. Another story that I think is very fascinating is the story in John chapter 9, the story of the blind man. The man born blind. And the disciples asked Christ, well, whose fault was it? Did his parents sin, or did he sin that he was born blind? How did this happen? Because if anything bad was happening, it must be because of sin. That was the way they understood things. But Christ said this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. I think there is a tremendous lesson in this half of a verse for all of us. Why were you born? What's your spot? When's going to be your moment? You know, it's kind of easy to look back at the history of Daniel and Joseph and Mordecai and see why they were put in the positions that they were. The seed line of Christ progressed no matter what. No matter what, it couldn't be stopped. God always made provision for Christ to be born from the very beginning until he rose again, and now serves with God. We can look back and we can see all of that, but let's look at this blind man in John chapter 9. He hasn't accomplished anything. And as far as we know, he never did. Up to this point, he'd been a burden to his family even. He's blind. He can't produce anything. Not in those days. This is a bad situation to be in. He's a burden. But this one day, This moment in time, this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. And he stood up to the Pharisees in a way that others couldn't. I don't know if you can read that. I can, so I guess you can. The Pharisees challenged him, who healed you? How did they do that? He stood up to these Pharisees. He's been a nobody, and he stood up to the most powerful people in Jerusalem as far as the Jews were concerned. The man answered, now that is remarkable. You know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners. He listens to the godly person who does his will. Nobody has ever heard of someone opening the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. Boy, did he infuriate the Pharisees. They were furious. And, of course, they threw him out of the synagogue. But he made a difference that day, because the Pharisees weren't the only ones that heard what he had to say. He helped people believe in Jesus that day. He had that one moment in time. He was second to nobody but Jesus. He made a difference that day. One of the best features of the kingdom of Christ is that we are not simply subjects in that kingdom. We are co-heirs with him. In Romans chapter 8, it says, the Spirit himself testifies with our spirit that we are God's children. Now, if we are children, then we are heirs. Heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ. Have you thought of the magnitude of that, being a co-heir in the kingdom of Christ? It's remarkable. If indeed we share in his sufferings, in order that we may also share in his glory. You see, no one is higher or lesser than another in the kingdom of Christ. We are all second to Christ. And what is the striving? I told you at the beginning we're going to be striving for second. What is the striving? It's living. Remaining faithful, striving to be faithful each and every day. Because if we strive to be faithful, we will be faithful. It's when you give up, it's when you turn your back that you fail. If you strive, and that doesn't mean you make it, but you strive, and you keep striving. And you're second, just like Daniel, just like Joseph, Mordecai. Being co-heirs with Christ? Wow. When their moment came, they served. Do you serve when your moment comes? I always wonder when that moment's going to be. Do you? What were you thinking that day when you left this world, the world, died to the world, and were made alive to Christ in Christ's kingdom? When you left the kingdom of the world and entered Christ's kingdom, what did you think you were going to do next? Where did you think you were going to end up? I certainly never thought I was going to end up here talking to all of you 40 years ago, 30 years ago, whatever it was. That wasn't on my mind. When's that moment going to be for you? Are you going to be ready? You're going to be striving at the right time and ready to be second? Are you ready to take charge of the kingdom that's given to you to take charge of? What's going to be given to you as a position of influence? Everybody around you. That's who. The blind man didn't pick who was going to be listening that day. He couldn't even see Jesus. How were your eyes? How can you see? Well, he put some mud on my eyes and told me to go wash, and I could see. That's all the understanding that he had. But he knew that it was Jesus, and he knew that it was special. He knew that it was something that he needed to stand up for. So striving for second is just another way of saying striving to remain faithful. That's what we need to do. We all know it. But do we think of it that way? Living doesn't sound as strong as striving. Striving to remain faithful, because some days it's not easy. Some days it's a really, really big challenge, and some days we just plain old fail. But you know who we're second to? Christ. He's the only one. We answer to him. And that's it. You were important to him. He gave his life for you. So being in Christ's kingdom is an awesome thing. If you have not been baptized into Christ, into his kingdom, you need to be. There's no dancing around it. You just need to be. You need to be in his kingdom. You need to join the rest of us. And those of you who are in his kingdom and you're not ready for the moment, if you're not ready to serve, if you haven't been serving like you should, you've just been a spectator, been hanging out and not striving, why don't you come down here and let's pray together. Join me as we stand and sing.